Hi guys, so Editing Gabby here. Before we get started with this video, I had a intro clip made for this video and I think I may have accidentally deleted it when I was trying to move files to my computer. That intro clip is now gone. So pretty much all I was really doing though was just kind of talking about what the book is going to be about, reading the synopsis, that kind of a thing. So I just wanted to kind of quickly go over it just so we can get really right into the video. Basically, this is following Wizard and Glass, which is the fourth book in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. If you have not been watching any of my Dark Tower videos or any of my Stephen King reading series videos, I will leave the link for that down in the description. And for those of you that may know, have been watching my videos for a while, these particular videos are spoiler filled because I go in depth, chapter by chapter, part by part, going into what the book talks about, where things are coming up, like theories, things of that nature, and then what about the story I'm liking, stuff like that. So it's very much a step-by-step process, which is why many of the videos, especially when it gets to getting into the Dark Tower series itself, are super long. Basically, what we get into with Wizard and Glass, like I said, it is the fourth book, so you will have had to have read the last 3 books in the series beforehand, but this is piggybacking essentially right off the end of The Wastelands, which was book 3, where essentially we learn that there's this train called Blaine the Mono that is something that the gang, which involves Roland S. Chain, Eddie Dean, Susanna Dean, Jake Chambers, and a little Billy Bumbler by the name of Oi. They get on this train in order to travel closer to the Dark Tower, but at the end of The Wastelands we learn that Blaine has kind of a nefarious plot in mind, where he doesn't want to actually take these people all the way to the tower, or the place where he can drop them off at. If anything, he wants to kill them and himself. They decide basically that they're going to do a riddle contest because Blaine is really into riddles, and he learns about a riddle contest that Roland had done growing up in Gilead. And so Blaine is like, okay, we're gonna do this, and if I win, I get to kill all of us, and if you guys win, I will take you all the way to where I can drop you off on your way to the tower, essentially, and you will leave unscathed. And that's kind of where we end The Wastelands, and this is picking right up after that. However, the synopsis in the back of the book does talk more too about how this is very much a prequel story, which I will say now, and you will hear me say this many times over the course of this video, that this is very much a story that deals with a lot of prequel information, because in the synopsis what it says is that Roland talks to the whole gang about essentially one of the reasons why he became so obsessed with the Dark Tower, essentially what was kind of the starting point of his entire journey, where he meets a woman named Susan Delgado, who we've heard little bits and pieces of as time has gone on since The Gunslinger, and a woman named Rhea of the Coos, and various other characters. And there's a lot to do with this. Like, this is basically 80% of the book, I would say, is dealing with this story. I go to end that whole thing and then realize that I also lost the footage of the first 200 pages that I had read of Wizard and Glass. First and foremost, what I can say is that the very beginning of the book, we open up right at the end of what happens in the Wasteland. So there's like a couple lines, like a prologue of sorts, that picks up essentially the same scene that we end the Wastelands on with Roland, Susanna, Eddie, Jake, and Oi, where they're gonna get started on the riddle contest. And essentially the fact of the matter is they go through the whole thing. They're having some struggles with trying to best Blaine the Mono. He seems to be getting really, really irritated though, because there's some certain things where he realizes like that they're not riddles, and that's what Eddie ends up using against him. Long story short, TLDR, basically, they win the riddle contest, and Blaine ends up basically like self-combusting in a sense, like right as they're getting to this place that he's meant to drop them off at. And then what we see is the gang ends up in this place, Topeka, like Topeka, Kansas. And it turns out that this area is completely devoid of life. There's cars that are packing the highways, there's dead bodies everywhere, and there's a newspaper article that they find that talks about the disease Captain Trips, which if any of you have read the book The Stand, you would know that that is the super flu that is in the Stand that basically wipes out most of humanity. There's a lot of other ties then that talk about the Crimson King, who is Randall Flagg, that we see, and we actually saw him in the end of the Wastelands. He had picked up this guy that was called the TikTok Man, that basically, I don't know why he was called that, but he was essentially a follower, like he became a follower of this man Randall Flagg, and decides he's going to go with him wherever he goes in order to stop Roland and his team from getting to the Dark Tower. And so we see a bunch of notes and messages about the Crimson King as they're going through Topeka. And essentially at one point they start hearing this thing called a Thinny, which is basically this invisible monster of sorts that emits this really high frequency whine, and the closer you get to it, the worse it gets, and then it actually starts to mess with your mind a little bit, and it essentially becomes like a siren almost, where it draws you in, and then that is how it can kill you. So while they're going through this journey, they decide to stop for a couple of nights because they realize that like it's going to take some time to get to this one place they're heading toward, which they don't even know exactly what it is. They just know they have to head toward this building, this thing that is still a ways away. So they decide to camp for the night, and Roland decides that he's going to tell the gang the story of how he met the woman Susan Delgado, who, like I said, we had learned quite a bit about over the course of the last several books. And he decides this because he thinks that there is something likely that comes up in this past that may help them, or at the very least there's so much guilt in his heart for what happened because he blames himself for a lot of the things that had happened during this time, that he feels like he needs to get it off his chest in order to really give the gang an idea of why he's so obsessed with the Dark Tower. What is it that really sent him off to go chasing this Dark Tower and go chasing this man in black? So he does tell them about essentially his coming of age ceremony with Court that we learned about in The Gunslinger, where he bests his teacher, and afterward he goes to a whorehouse at the age of 14 and he has sex for the first time, which was kind of strange to read about because it's not very often I see 14-year-olds having sex, even though it's entirely possible that they do. But anyway, his father comes in and berates him for it, and he's like, what are you doing? You're being stupid. Have you forgotten the face of your father? Basically is this kind of like common phrase of like, you're being a fucking idiot. What they find out is that Roland has known for a while that his mother's been cheating on his father with this man named Martin, who is this magician of sorts. He is basically trying to take over the leadership in Gilead, which his father is a part of. And his father reveals that he's known this for about 2 years, and because he knows and because he understands that Martin's trying to take over, he knows that Roland is likely to be killed because he would be in Martin's way. So essentially what happens is Stephen, Roland's father, sends off Roland, his best friends Cuthbert and Elaine, off to this place called Magus, and says, you're going there under the, guise of being a part of what's called the Association, I think. Something like that. Basically some kind of like government organization from Gilead that's going to like check in on these towns to like make sure that they're upkeeping their books essentially and like everything's actually correct. And you learn later on that his father's also having him look for something specific if they find it, but you don't know what that is, just something about it being pink. You then start to learn also that there's a lot of people in this town of Magus, that there's a lot of corruption surrounding around this town. You have this woman who is named Rhea of the Coos, and she's this witch. And the very, very beginning, you learn that Susan Delgado, the young woman that Roland becomes the lover of essentially, she is being told that she has to become the, I don't know how exactly you would say it, consort maybe, I guess they do call her that every now and then, the consort of the mayor of Magus, because he is incredibly old, he and his wife are not able to have children, and they want to use her basically as his mistress to carry his child because she's 16, and in order for this to go through, she has to go to Rhea to be proven that she's honest. Basically showcase that she's a virgin and that she's never, gone through sex or anything like that. Honestly, there is a little bit of a assault scene within this that I will warn you that there, like, especially when it comes to this interaction with Rhea and Susan. And we learned that Rhea also has this orb that she got from this man Jonas, and this orb allows her to see things that are happening, like looking into the lives of people. She can't hear anything, but it emits this pink glow that causes her to be able to see things that are currently happening. It's like the only thing this thing is able to do, but it doesn't work just by your will. Like, you can't just tell it to show you something. It will only show you something when you need to see it, or like when it feels as if you are worthy of seeing something at that time. So Rhea becomes, you see very quickly, obsessed with it. And after Susan does something that offends Rhea essentially starts concocting a plan to humiliate Susan, get back at her, all these things, because this woman is old, decrepit, ugly, like just plain nasty. And it kind of starts this whole thing from there. Then we see Susan and Roland meet up for the first time, and they immediately are attracted to each other. But Susan knows she's destined to be with this guy, the mayor, because they say that the reason is because her father, who died a few years beforehand, would have wanted this. Her aunt specifically, her Aunt Cordelia, is pressuring Susan to do this and remain a virgin because it's going to cause some kind of renown. And you start to get an inkling that Aunt Cordelia is really only doing this because of some monetary possibility, because the circumstances in which that her father let her in was pretty shady. Didn't really seem like Aunt Cordelia was wanting to actually be an aunt. It's more of like she just wanted to get money kind of thing. And Susan's very well aware of this. And like you see other perspectives as time goes on. Like there's one particular character named Jonas, who is the leader of this group called the Big Coffin Hunters, who essentially are like the brute force when it comes to this town, but they're also dealing with a lot of shady stuff. They are basically the ones that are super involved in, you learn later, about a lot of the corruption that's involved in this town. And Jonas is just a guy who is very bitter about a lot of things. He's an older man, and you learn about how he used to be a gunslinger, but was unable to best his master, and so then was sent out in exile. And then what we learn is that the boys are, Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, are also not only going under the assumption that, you know, they're under this association, but they're also going under different names, with Roland specifically going under the name of Will Dearborn. So that's how everybody knows their name. But you learn that essentially they are checking on essentially the bookkeeping of this town. They start seeing things as kind of not how it's being presented, where like the amount of cattle that they have is way more than it is noted in like ledgers and stuff like that. And so they're kind of investigating that. They're investigating a lot of other stuff, and they realize like there's a little bit more of a nefarious plot going on that we learn later, that I explain, is involving a certain character that actually ties back to things that are happening in Gilead currently. So it is now about almost 20 to 2 in the afternoon on Monday, August 2nd. I have now reached page 300. I actually am really liking this a lot more than I thought I would. I don't know why. I felt like partway through I was just gonna get really bored, but I think that because this is talking so much so far about Roland's backstory, and honestly the backstory's gotten to be kind of interesting, I feel like this is going to be a wonderful book. I will be genuinely surprised if I only give this a 4-star at this point, because so far I've really liked everything that's gone on. But let me talk about what happened. So the last time I talked to you guys, I was fairly certain that this character we met that was named Will Dearborn was going to be Roland, and very beginning of chapter 4 we find out that's the case, that essentially Roland has changed his name to Will Dearborn, most likely to protect his identity because of the fact that his father had sent him off with his friends Cuthbert and Elaine, who were friends of his throughout most of his life. He sends them off to do something to get him away basically from Martin. Roland goes back to his camp where Cuthbert and Elaine are, and he talks to Cuthbert about meeting Susan and how he's, you know, she's beautiful, how he's very much into her, but there's something weird going on where, you know, she said to him that she wasn't necessarily tied to anybody, but things were very complicated, and so he's not sure what that means. And Cuthbert's kind of like, well, dude, we're not supposed to, you know, be getting involved with people. We've got like an actual job to do, and it's mostly to make sure to keep appearances that you're not Roland Deschanel. Roland tells Cuthbert about the politics going on, where they're basically posing as these people called the Association, something like that. Essentially, they're just a group of people that were supposed to come into town to learn about the town and get some information to take back to Gilead, because I guess Gilead's like a reigning town of some kind. He starts to, you know, have very sexualized dreams of Susan, who, mind you, is 2 years older than 14-year-old Roland at this time. The second part is we go back to Susan, who ends up getting home to her Aunt Cordelia, who is her caretaker, the person that's been raising her since her father died, and she gives her the note from the witch, Rhea, that says she's honest, that she's good, you know, that she's, you know, perfect for being the mayor's consort. You learn that Aunt Cordelia is pretty awful in terms of the fact that she's obviously using Susan to get something from the mayor. Like, basically she thinks of Susan as kind of her meal ticket in a sense, where, and I don't know if that's necessarily the most appropriate verbiage, but that's the kind of best way I can think of it, is because Susan seems to be Aunt Cordelia's way into the political system or into the good graces of the mayor, and she will somehow benefit from that. And then part 3, we basically go in on a scene at this bar that these 3 men frequent, which these guys are called the big coffin hunters. They start talking about essentially like a little bit about like the story that we already know about Susan being promised to the mayor. Jonas talks about how they basically like are trying in a sense to play the game so that somehow maybe Jonas can get to the front of all of it, like become the mayor. That's kind of the idea I'm getting from him, because essentially he's the kind of guy that is like the henchman who wants to end up taking over, so he's going to do what he can to prove that he's able, and then somehow possibly cause like a mutiny of some sort that's going to overthrow the current ruler. It's kind of the gist that I get with him. Then we move into chapter 5, which essentially is this thing where Cuthbert, Roland, and Elaine go to the mayor, or they first at least go to meet with some people to be able to talk to the mayor, and they're like, hey, we're from this group, the affiliation, that's what they're called. So they say that they're from the affiliation, that they're here to talk to the mayor, like it's really important that they do because this is part of their job, and most people know what the affiliation is, but they also, you start to see, kind of don't believe that this group of 14-year-old boys could be a part of the affiliation. They think that something's kind of hokey, something's a little up. Essentially, though, they talk to the high sheriff, who then talks to the mayor, and they get invited to this big party that's going to be happening. And before, when we had seen Roland and Susan talk, Susan had said that if he gets invited to this party, he needs to act as if it doesn't exist up until that party, and that's the first time he meets her, because there could be some bad repercussions if it is shown that they've known each other before this party. And they start meeting a bunch of people. They start meeting, the mayor, his wife, they're both much older, and Roland sees Susan for the first time and tries to act like it's the first time that he's seen her. But Aunt Cordelia knows a thing or two about how things are, and so she at one point pulls Susan aside and is like, don't fuck this up. I don't care how you know that kid. You don't know him. Your main focus is on the mayor, because I will have to be dead and in a grave somewhere before I let you do anything that your father said you weren't supposed to. Which I think that the whole thing with that is that I don't think her father would necessarily really want her to marry the mayor, but everyone's saying that it's for her father's sake, which is the reason why Susan does what she does, because she was very close to her father, and with his passing, a lot of stuff was kind of left up in the air, and so she's kind of believing everybody talking about the fact that this is something her father would have wanted. But I'm getting the distinct feeling that even she's kind of starting to wonder, is this really what her father would want, for her to be the consort of the mayor, who by all means is a fucking perv. He is weird. He is very much like just a nasty old man. Then Roland finds out through a couple of people at this party that Susan is kind of involved with the mayor, but they don't tell him how. They don't say anything about the fact that Susan is going to be kind of like the surrogate mother in a sense of their children, because they don't have an heir. And on top of that, the mayor is just very attracted to Susan because she's a beautiful young girl, and he's just a fucking creep. But you learn very quickly that Roland is not okay with that. He kind of feels like he's been let on in a sense. So eventually they go to dance, Roland and Susan, and Roland gets pissed at her. So then we move into chapter 6, which is a very interesting several parts. So what happens is at this bar, one of the big coffin hunters, DePape, he gets a bunch of alcohol spilled over him by one of the servers that is kind of a slower person in this bar. And he gets so pissed that he threatens to essentially like humiliate him and then later on kill this guy. So then what happens is you see Cuthbert and Elaine pop in. So you've got DePape who's trying to kill and humiliate the server, and then Cuthbert threatens him, and then Reynolds, one of the other big coffin hunters, threatens Cuber, and then Elaine comes in, threatens Reynolds, and then you have Jonas who comes in and threatens Elaine. And all of this is kind of happening all together, and you start kind of seeing like when people start coming into this whole situation, and you see Roland, who kind of had gone away from Cuthbert and Elaine at one point, find out something's happening, comes to the bar, and as Jonas is threatening Elaine, who's threatening Reynolds, who's threatening Cuthbert, who's threatening DePape, who's threatening the server, Roland comes in at the very end of it all and threatens Jonas. And so then the whole thing kind of destroys like dominoes, where just one person stops doing something, so the other person stops, so the other person stops, so the other person stops. It just made me laugh very, very hard. Probably harder than it should have. I just really liked seeing the whole thing come up, because it's not very often you get kind of comical scenes like that in any kind of fantasy story. And I think it's just even more funny that this is something that I'm seeing Roland tell to Eddie, Susanna, and Jake, and like I could see their reaction to the whole thing being like, oh my god, like, oh my god, oh my god, like with each person that's coming into the line of the altercation. So it was very, very funny to me. So that's pretty much all that has happened. So they get the whole thing solved, and then the server, who is traumatized, runs behind the bar and is like crying and sobbing, the poor thing, because he's just been threatened with his life. Going pretty well so far. Really like it. I think this is honestly so far beating out both the Wastelands and the Drawing of Three, like out of the water. So I'm excited to see how the rest of this goes and whether that whole trend continues. Hey guys, so it is now going on 11 o'clock in the morning on August 6th, it's Friday. It's been a few days since I last talked to you because my mental health over the last week has been pretty shoddy. That being said, I just now got to page 400 after sitting here and listening to the last 100 pages on audio as I've been working. So let's go over quickly what everything was. Part 8 of this chapter, everybody that was involved in the fight, which are Jonas, DePape, who is the one who started the fight, Reynolds, all the big coffin hunters, and then Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, who are going under different names because of their need to hide their identities. They all end up going into like the sheriff's office, and the sheriff is like, okay, well, I don't want to arrest any of you guys because arresting the big coffin hunters would be kind of looking bad on the town itself, in a sense. Then arresting Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, who are supposedly a part of the affiliation, would look bad to the affiliation. So sheriff is like, shake hands and be done with it, kind of thing. Also, please excuse how I speak because I've had a stuffy nose also all week, so I sound really stuffy. I know, I'm sorry, it's just kind of how it is. My allergies have just been really, really bad this past week. So part 9, they all leave the deputy's office and essentially just kind of make up. Then part 10, when the big coffin hunters go to leave, they stop, and Jonas essentially is like, something's up with these guys. They act more like gunslingers than anything else. And they're also really young, which so it doesn't make sense, but they could be apprentices. So he basically sends DePape, because DePape was the one that got them into this mess, to find out about how these guys came here and if they're gunslingers or not. Then part 11, we go back to Roland, and Roland kind of talks about how like there's going to be trouble ahead because these big coffin hunter guys are not to be messed with. There is something kind of nefarious going on, and he thinks that there's going to be trouble ahead for them. So then we go into chapter 7, which is called On the Drop, and it's about 3 weeks later, and we kind of basically start off with looking at Susan for a while, who we learn essentially that Susan is about done with everything that her aunt has been trying to get her to do. Her aunt's just kind of been really grating on her because Susan doesn't even want to be involved in this thing where she's going to be the mayor's consort of some kind, and is basically she chews out her aunt. And you learn that when her aunt was really down on her luck, they took her in. Susan and her father took her in, and ever since has kind of taken advantage of this entire thing. And then when Susan's father died, she took it upon herself to be the, head of the household. And Susan's like, know your place. Like, you could have easily been turned out by my father again at any point in time. This is my home. This is mine and my father's house. You have literally just been a guest for like ever. And then you start seeing that Susan is still fawning over Roland, essentially. She still knows him as Will, but you're starting to see like how very quickly she's falling for him. And then one day, Sheemy, who is the slower character that causes essentially the riffraff in the bar, he comes over to their house bringing flowers, and Aunt Cord's really kind of distressed about that because she knows that they can't be from the mayor, and she doesn't see a note, but the note that Susan finds is from Roland, and he asks if he can see her, and she basically at first is like, no, I can't see you, it's not going to be proper, all these things. Eventually they end up actually meeting, like they end up just deciding to meet no matter what, kind of talk about a lot of the stuff that's going on, and you can see like the tension between the sexual tension between the two of them. She's also starting to understand that Roland is not, who he might say he is. She's understanding that there's something else going on, and he starts asking her questions about how this town is, because he's supposed to be for the affiliation, and a lot of times the affiliation will get some information about the town and make sure things are on the up and up, all that kind of stuff. So through learning about, the numbers of things that like this town has, Roland's starting to understand that there's actually more. Like, I don't know how you would say it. It's almost like there's kind of some kind of tax evasion kind of thing in a sense. They're saying that they don't have as much as they actually do because having more would cause some kind of thing in this town, and Roland's kind of understanding that this is like an issue. And they don't say why it's necessarily an issue because they're not actually supposed to be a part of the affiliation, but they do realize that whatever is happening, Susan starts to realize could very well have to do with why her father died in the accident that he died in. The two of them basically share a kiss, and they realize that like they've got strong feelings for each other, but they can't do anything about it because obviously it would cause massive, massive problems for not only Susan, but then for Roland as well. Then in part 10 of this chapter, we have Sheriff and them talking about how, at first they didn't think that these little coffin hunters, as they call them, which are Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert, they didn't realize that being so young, they would be so tough. And so everyone's starting to talk about how they're getting to be, pretty tough, and how they are more than they seem, and that's causing all kinds of like rumors and stuff to start going around. Then we have the boys end up getting a message from somebody who's from the outside, who likely is going to be somebody that we know, which could be Roland's father, Stephen, somebody on the outside, essentially sending in a message to check in on them, and they send one back saying that everything seems to be fine. Then we get into chapter 8, which is Beneath the Peddler's Moon. And we start off where we follow Roy DePape, who was told to go off and find information about the boys to figure out if they are gunslingers and what they're here for. And he ends up running into an old man who talks about seeing 3 young men come through this area that he goes to, and how they seem to be like really young for their age, but incredibly strong and very powerful people. And Roy essentially finds out that these people, that those 3 young men are Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert, and the old man basically says that he recognizes one of them, Roland, because this man knew Roland's father and Roland's grandfather, and so that puts Roy essentially in the mindset that these are these kids, and they are in fact gunslingers. And so then he starts to head back to Jonas. We go back to Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, who are heading actually to this area where this thing called the Thinny is, which we've seen the Thinny already in the entirety of the beginning with Roland, Jake, Eddie, Susanna, and Oid. So they're going out to track this thing down, and they start talking about kind of how things are going, what's going on. And the closer they get to this Thinny, the more that Roland starts to realize that this Thinny causes like some massive mental instability. Like, it causes people to start hearing things, causes people to like really like become, in a sense, almost suicidal. Like, it just kind of causes the brain to really fight against itself, and it makes people very unstable. So they leave after that, and not finding anything in particular, and Roland decides that he needs to see Susan again, because even with this like adventure, they're realizing there's something much more nefarious going on, and he's starting to like piece things together. So we get into chapter 9 called Sitco, which the Sitco they mentioned earlier in the book in this town was kind of this like abandoned like oil area, never really used for anything. There apparently had been nothing there for a long time. So we start off with Susan and seeing how she's doing currently, taking care of her horse, all of these things, and then she gets another note from Roland asking her to meet him at the Sitco. At first, she really does not think it's a good idea, again, because it could still cause massive problems for her to be seen with him, but she does send him a note to have him meet her at this orange grove not far from the Sitco. And when they meet up, they are in a very passionate embrace. Like, they really like understand that what they have is something special. In part 10 of this chapter, we go back to Rhea, who is the witch that had to essentially assault Susan. That's the nicest way to say it. Assaulted her in order to figure out whether or not she was still a virgin. And she's seeing all this happen in this little glass ball that she's had, that we've known about since the beginning. And she's laughing to herself because she knows that this is kind of what she was wanting, was Susan to kind of lose her mind. And it's kind of payback for the fact that Susan had kind of dismissed Rhea as this ugly, awful human being, which she is, don't get me wrong, but Rhea, in a sense, has started the seedlings of revenge, and it's now starting to blossom at this point. So then with Roland and Susan, they start talking about what's going on. Susan actually starts asking questions of Roland, and he starts to reveal his true identity. He tells her that he's not really a part of the affiliation, that his name's Roland, and, you know, they kind of start actually talking about what the real thing that they're doing is. And Roland tells Susan that there's something nefarious going on, and they go to the Sitco to prove that. They're going there to possibly see proof of these nefarious acts, because what Roland says is that there's a bunch of oxen, which Susan's like, there's never been oxen here, what are you talking about? And Roland essentially starts showing her and telling her that somebody's been lying about the stuff that happened. And now she's starting to really understand, because she had known that it's possible her father had been killed for whatever was happening here. And it's becoming more and more apparent for her as they go through the Sitco and see that there's oil that's been leaking for a while that otherwise seemed to have been non-existent. You know, there's animals that are there, there's trails of the oxen that have left, and there's even proof that Roy DePape was in this area. She's starting to really see the entire scope of this issue, because now she's understanding that the big coffin hunters have had a huge hand in whatever has happened here that very well could have killed her father. And that's pretty much all we learn at this point, other than the fact that the two of them then share a very passionate moment together, and Susan realizes that she's being watched, and she thinks she knows who's watching, and it's the witch, and she's like, go away, like, I know you're spying on me, fuck off, basically. And that's where we end up on page 400. Honestly, this is a book where, like, yes, it could have been by itself a prequel, but we did have to see exactly how the thing with Blaine the Mono happened in the beginning, like what exactly had gone on. Is it possible that could have been thrown in at the end of the Wastelands, and that Wizard in Glass could have been its own prequel novel? Yes, that's entirely possible. But I think that the majority of this story is going to play out the story of Roland and Susan, and then at the very end we're going to see why that's so important to know, and then how that traverses the team to where they need to be. This is all happening when he's like 14 years old, and that already is like very jarring for me, because Roland reads so much older, but that's because I've seen him as this much older person for so long. And when he's living in Gilead as a 14-year-old kid, like, that's a whole different experience than being a 14-year-old kid in our world. He's gone through so much stuff at 14 that it's not a surprise he ends up acting more as an adult, because he's matured. He's, you know, really been through the ringer to where emotionally he is like a 40-year-old person. And I think that's why Susan's so attracted to him at 16, even though he's younger than her, because he has that very old soul quality that comes from, you know, having dealt with so much stuff at a young age, that those experiences make you feel like you're so much older as it is. Hey guys, so it's now just about 3:15 in the afternoon, and I've reached page 503. So let's go over the last couple hundred pages, or not couple hundred, the last 100 pages. Let's do that. Part 15 of the chapter we were on goes to Rhea, who I had said before, the ending of what I had read last time was that when Roland and Susan were, you know, getting together, hooking up, you know, kind of thing, Rhea seemed to be spying on them, and Susan could feel it. So this goes to Rhea, who is spying on them, and essentially she is laughing. Her whole thing has been that once Susan loses her virginity, something's going to happen. Now, it was intended for her to lose her virginity to the mayor that she's been promised to. Further into the Citgo area and find more stuff, and they end up finding out like the real important information of what this whole secret that the big coffin hunters are hiding, what the mayor might be hiding, all these things. They're starting to like really piece stuff together. Then they go back to the orchard that they were at and kind of start to go their separate ways. And what happens is Susan basically admits to Roland that she loves him. And she even says that, you know, if he loves her, then he needs to help her break her promise to the mayor, and he refuses. He says that he's not going to do that, and they end up going their separate ways, and Roland, on his own, ends up going back to the boys. He ends up going back to Cuthbert and Elaine, and they kind of just break it off from there. Then we move into chapter 10, which is called Bird and Bear and Hare and Fish. And essentially, this is 2 weeks following the rendezvous that they had. Basically, this whole chapter is like the two of these characters finally coming together and like actually becoming lovers. That's pretty much the whole point of it, because Susan realizes like how much she really loves Roland, even more than when she told him she loved him. She's like just completely falling for him, and Aunt Cordelia is thinking like there's something going on, because Susan keeps lashing out at her. She keeps, you know, yelling and screaming and just completely disregarding anything that her aunt is telling her. Aunt Cordelia is basically just getting to the point where she's starting to guess something's happening. But after Susan gets back to her home after going through like a fitting basically, and finding out that the dress she's supposed to wear for the reaping is destroyed and they have to make a new one, she gets home, she's crying. She's just beside herself. And so she decides to tell Aunt Cordelia about how while she was getting fitted, the mayor basically came in and like assaulted her. I don't think he necessarily raped her, because they don't talk about that she lost her virginity, but he like completely assaulted her and grabbed her, and just like, it was not pretty. Aunt Cordelia says that, you know, this is kind of what you signed up for, like you shouldn't be feeling like this. You're kind of making a big deal out of nothing, it seems like. And Susan gets rightfully upset. She gets pissed, and so Susan rides away. She ends up going to this area that she frequented when like she was upset as a child, and Roland comes by and he's like, hey, what's wrong? Like, she's just not okay. And he tells her to ask again, to say it again, and he will. And she says that if he loves her, to then love her, meaning to like have sex with her. And so they do. And that's kind of where things start to go crazy, because what then happens is, like, after they've done that, she thinks that, you know, it's possible that now she could be pregnant with this child, and she's asking if he's going to take care of her and if he's going to, like, stay by her. So they completely become lovers at this point. And then we jump to Rhea, who we see, like, now something's going to happen. We see that, like, this seed was planted and now it's going to blossom now that Susan's lost her virginity. And what happens is that she wakes up and just completely, like, glazed over look, like she's possessed. And Roland wakes up to find her looking for a jagged rock, and she's cutting off her hair and likely going to unintentionally hurt herself, whether that was the intention for Rhea to have her do or not. Either way, Roland essentially is able to snap her out of it, and she's concerned, he's concerned, and he starts to actually go through this thing where he is able to hypnotize her and learn, like, that Rhea put her under this spell, essentially, or this, like, hypnosis. They don't know why. They just, you know, something was to be done with this. And then he basically gets her to come out of it, and I guess in some way this has, like, passed. Like, Rhea's hypnotism is no longer, like, gonna work because she was doing it, and then he snapped her out of it, basically. And then they decide that they're gonna try to maintain their relationship but keep it on the sly, which is very difficult because with Susan's promise to being the mayor's consort, now that's now no longer going to be valid, but nobody else knows about that, just the two of them and Rhea. Cordelia meets with Eldred. Eldred ends up helping, who's Mr. Jonas, one of the big coffin hunters. He ends up, you know, helping, taking her groceries to the house, and this kind of makes Cordelia kind of have her own little crush, in a sense. Like, you start to see a little bit of a more humanizing aspect to her, because not many men, like, take kindly to her. When she sees Susan, she kind of sees that her hair's damp, like she went swimming, and she's concerned because she thinks that Susan's gone and done something stupid, because anything Susan does to her is stupid. So then we end that part entirely, and we go into the interlude where we go back to Eddie, Susanna, Roland, Jake, and Oy, and essentially Eddie's like, dude, you've been talking forever, like, what is happening? Like, how do you remember all of this stuff? You've been talking for what seems like literal days. And at first, Roland doesn't, like, want to continue because this is a very hard story for him. As we saw in the beginning, it's something that he doesn't want to remember, but it's something that keeps coming up because he thinks that the actions he had in this story lead him to where he is now, and it's kind of his ka. So they tell him to start the story again, and then we move into part 3, which is Come Reap. Chapter 1, Beneath the Huntress Moon, starts off where he talks about how true love is dangerous. Like, it's an addictive drug because, you know, it's something that can destroy, but something that can also create, in a sense. And so then this is kind of still leading up to the reaping. I think this entire part is going to be leading up to the Reaping Moon, which is the big festival, because at where I'm at now, it's getting very close to that. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. A lot of stuff about basically how Roland and Susan, you know, keep their love going for what seems several weeks. They meet constantly, and they find different ways to meet, hook up, basically. At one point, though, Cuthbert gets really pissed about it because there's a little bit of, like, a double edge to this with Cuthbert's, like, rage toward Roland. He thinks that Roland is getting himself distracted, and this is kind of not what they were supposed to be doing when they were set out by Roland's father. But at the same time, Cuthbert also is kind of like, this girl is stealing my best friend, but also my best friend is hooking up with this girl who's incredibly beautiful, and whether or not he's in love with Roland is something to be determined, but I think it's more of the fact that, like, he wants somebody too, and it just so happens that Roland is the more attractive one of the three of them, but they're all still so young. They're all still, like, 14, 13 years old. Like, they're, like, this is stuff that you, again, would not think a 14-year-old kid would be thinking. But sometimes, depending on what's happened in their life, 14-year-olds can be pretty mature. Essentially, Elaine and Cuthbert talk about this problem that Cuthbert has with Roland, and Elaine's kind of just like, dude, you need to, like, everything's fine. He's not doing anything to hurt any of us. Like, just let him do what he's going to do. If it becomes an issue, we'll deal with it then. But for now, it's not causing any major issues. The main mission's still going. Like, we're still going to come out with this stuff about, you know, the fact that there's all this stuff that the big coffin hunters are hiding that somehow is bad. It's still not really clear on how any of that's bad. But then you start seeing how the big coffin hunters, they're starting to scheme because they know that the trio of Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine are starting to gain on them. They're starting to learn about what it is that they're doing, but they don't know how to go about stopping them without then outing themselves and what they're doing. And so Jonas is getting kind of irritated with it. So then we jump back to Rhea again, who essentially is pissed because things did not go as she had planned in how things were supposed to go for Susan. She's pissed that her plan didn't work because Roland basically screwed it up for her. And then what Rhea does is she basically communicates with some deity, some entity of some kind, to essentially get her plan to start working again, and that can, like, is starting to ruminate. And we move into chapter 2, which is called The Girl at the Window. Usually people are starting to prepare for the festival. It's getting really close, where they're getting close to harvest time because the summer's starting to end. And then we go back to Rhea again, who, you know, she is kind of starting to get stuff set up for herself. She's trying to get stuff figured out to prepare for Reaping Night because there's some kind of nefarious plot that she's got going on. And then we go back to Elaine, Cuthbert, and Roland, and they're kind of talking about all this stuff. And I think at this point Cuthbert kind of is like, dude, what are you doing? You're fucking everything up for all of us. Like, I can't believe you're doing this to all of us. Eventually he kind of recedes his argument because he realizes that Roland is, like, just not gonna budge, and he just still doesn't believe, though, that things are going to turn out the way that they wanted them to because Roland's been getting involved with Susan. More stuff about, you know, Susan and Roland being together. There's a point where Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine ride by the farm that Susan is at, and there's, like, this kind of moment that Aunt Cordelia sees that she's like, something could be going on here, but I'm not 100% sure, kind of thing. Roland's trio, they end up meeting with Jonas because they come up with this plan to basically, like, say that they're going to do some counting stuff and kind of just go around to the farms to do the counting that they're supposed to because it's, like, some kind of inventory kind of thing. And Jonas is not super happy about that because he knows that that's going to cause some major rifts because now he's understanding, like, this is what, you know, these guys are going to, like, find out and they're going to somehow out them, but he doesn't know, again, how to stop them without outing himself. So then we jump back to Susan and Aunt Cordelia, where Aunt Cordelia starts, you know, getting into Susan about, like, how do you know this kid? Like, have you been with him? You better not have because I'll kill you myself, kind of thing. And Susan gets real pissed at Aunt Cordelia and nearly hits her, and just, she runs into the barn and starts crying because it feels like Aunt Cordelia could take everything away from her. And basically Susan's, like, she feels powerless. She feels powerless to her aunt because although her aunt really shouldn't have any sway over what she does, she does because she's the adult. And although Susan is now 16, nearly an adult, she's not able to make her own decisions. She's been promised to this mayor against her will, basically, all for the fact that, you know, Cordelia says that this is what her father would want, which I'm willing to bet he wouldn't have, truthfully. Then we go back to the sheriff's area where there's, like, the big coffin hunters and Jonas and the boys. There's this thing that they keep talking about where Roland talks about playing this game Castles, where it's basically a strategy game. It's, you're trying to, like, cause somebody to come out so that you can shoot them. And Jonas is catching on that this is kind of what Roland might be trying to do. The boys end up going back to their home, and Cuthbert's kind of like, dude, I really hope you can pull this out because what you're doing now is you're getting distracted. You need to wake up because if you don't, we're gonna, like, be fucked. Then we move into chapter 3 called Playing Castles, where there's just a first thing. It talks about how it's been raining a lot and how there's been stolen moments with Roland and Susan. And then we basically have Aunt Cordelia then go to Jonas and she says that she needs to talk to him. He's the only person that she trusts in order to get advice from. And so they go to this tea house kind of thing, and she ends up telling him that she thinks Susan and Roland, are sneaking around. Then we go back to Rhea, who again is, starting to see everything, and she ends up plotting by using her cat Musty. Then we go back to Jonas and Cordelia, and on the way to walk back to her house, Jonas says that he's going to keep an eye on what's going on with Susan and Will, because he thinks that it's possible this is just kind of a distraction, that nothing's really happening, that, the fears that she has, while they may be valid fears, like, there can't be anything going on, because that would then mean that Roland has been basically still scheming under Jonas's nose without him knowing, and so he's not okay with that, but he's going to look into it because it could be important for him to know whether or not they're actually together. And so then he heads for Sitco from there. So that's pretty much the last 100 pages. Hi guys, so it is now Sunday. It's, I think, like 7 o'clock, maybe, almost, something like that. Anyway, not important. So I just reached page 600, so we're gonna go over the last little bit that I have read. There's been a lot in the last little bit that has talked more about what exactly the point is of Roland and his gang getting involved with Jonas and destroying the Sitco. There's not a whole heck of a lot more, but there is a scene that I'll get to in a little bit that talks about specifically a character that I had briefly mentioned named John Farson. There's like a whole thing with him in terms of like he's the reason that like Roland and his gang are even looking at what's going on here, because John Farson has some kind of a tie to what Roland's dad had basically sent them this way to go do. So the first thing, though, is that in part 6 of chapter 3, Jonas goes to the Sitco to check on the tankers and just kind of make sure that everything is right. What he does find, though, is this bird skull that actually belongs to Cuthbert. It was the bird skull that was sitting basically on the saddle of Cuthbert's horse. So that tells Jonas that at the very least, while they might not have messed anything up at the Sitco, the boys have been there and there's proof. So then we move to part 7, which is about this woman named Coral Thorin, who is essentially the sister of the mayor. She is also the owner of essentially the whorehouse that is within this town. She basically goes to the bar and gets a message from Rhea, the witch, who says to send Shimi to her. And typically what this is that Shimi will take some alcohol out to Rhea, and it's kind of a deal that they have because Rhea doesn't really get out very much because the Coos is quite a ways from town. So Rhea then sees Jonas, and they end up basically hooking up, which goes into the final part of that chapter. And they actually decide that they've never really had sex as good as they've had with each other, so they become kind of an item. Then we move into chapter 4, which is called Roland and Cuthbert, because this chapter is a lot of dealing with the fact that Roland and Cuthbert have been arguing for the last little while, and things kind of come to a head. So first we see basically Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine coming out of their place that they're staying in. Cuthbert's just kind of getting a little irritated. Like, that's just kind of a taste of seeing like how Cuthbert's getting very irritable for some reason, and which we know to be as the fact that he thinks that Roland's relationship with Susan is getting out of hand, that it's distracting him, that it's causing more problems than it should, that kind of thing. Part 2, we have Shimi being told he's going to go to the Coos. Part 3, when the boys are out, Jonas goes to the Barquet, which is the place that the boys are staying in, and he ransacks the place. He destroys their stuff. He pees on their clothes. He just causes all kinds of mayhem here to look like somebody was looking for something, or at the very least just to kind of show dominance. Like, he knows that they're involved in something and he's not happy about it. Part 4, then Elaine comes up and he says something's wrong. Like, I can tell something's wrong just because, you know, they end up going out to do some counting, which is what they're supposed to be doing in terms of like their job in this town. But Elaine comes up to Roland and is like, something's wrong. I think something's wrong back at the place that we're staying. We need to go back. And Roland's like, no, I know something's wrong, but we can't go back because we cannot show Jonas that we know what's going on. This is all a part of the scheme, basically. Then essentially there's more rummaging around. Jonas ends up finding the guns that the boys used, proving that they are gunslingers, which again, Roland kind of already knew was going to be happening, so he, puts them away. We go to part 6, which goes back to Rhea, who has Shimi bring the alcohol, all that stuff, and then she ends up giving Shimi this note that she says needs to go to Aunt Cordelia, and nobody else can use it, nobody else can see it, kind of thing. Part 7, we go back to Roland and Cuthbert and Elaine, who essentially go back to their home. Part 8, they look around to see the damage, all these things, and everything's destroyed. And Cuthbert gets really pissed because he's like, you're not doing anything about this. Are you freaking kidding me? And Cuthbert and Elaine end up getting kind of, in part 9, off on themselves. And Elaine's like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, why are you, like, acting like this? And Cuthbert's like, why the hell is Roland acting like this? All of our stuff's been, destroyed or messed with. And, he's acting like he's a freaking moron. And Elaine tries to show Cuthbert that Roland's actually doing what he's supposed to. It's just, what he's supposed to is not do anything at this point. And he tells Cuthbert that he needs to go off on a ride, just go away for a little bit and cool off. Part 10, Cuthbert does that. He goes back to town, and this is where he finds Shimi, and Shimi is not okay. And he gives Cuthbert the letter that he was supposed to give to Aunt Cordelia. Part 12, we go back to Rory and Jonas, and Rory talks to Jonas about this mysterious man who's come to town that seems to be involved with what they're doing with John Farson, all these things. And he talks about how this mysterious guy, he's scary. We only talked 5 minutes and all, but once I looked at him, I thought it was the old bastard from Ritzy, the one I shot, which was the one that he had talked to earlier that confirmed that the boys were gunslingers that he then killed. Then he says, a little bit later, I throw him a glance and think, hellfire, it's my old pa standing there. Then that went by too, and he looked like himself again. And then he says that he laughs like the dead, which he's like, I don't know what that means, but that's what it sounded like. And then part 13, Jonas actually goes to meet this person who goes by the name of Walter and is described as the Man in Black. So, first thing here, we have a huge tie already to the beginning of the story of the Man in Black, which we all know was also Martin, who is the man that was causing all of the issues in Roland's life in Gilead because he hooked up with Roland's mother and is the reason why he was sent to this town in Magus. Now, it's very apparent that this character has changed how he looks, has changed who he is to Walter O'Dim, which is the character in The Gunslinger that Roland is chasing for eons, it feels like. So, there's a huge tie right there. And then we also know that because of what happens in the Wastelands, Walter O'Dim is also Randall Flagg, who is the bad guy in The Stand, which was another book tied to the Dark Tower. So, then we go back to part 14 with Cuthbert, Roland, and Elaine, because Cuthbert comes back and he's like, guys, there's some fucked up shit going on. This is not good. And he starts talking to Roland about it, but he also essentially is like, I need to also kind of kick Roland's ass for being so fucking stupid. And then he hands Roland the letter that Shimi had for Aunt Cordelia, which basically says that Susan's not pure anymore because she and Roland had sex, and it's basically going to cause a massive rift and essentially could in fact send Susan out in exile. And then the boys will also be in trouble because they will be in just the shit with this whole thing. So essentially Roland's like, fuck, somebody saw us. I don't know how, but this is not good. Like, there is something seriously wrong here. There's nothing, like, this can't be good for what we're doing. So what they then decide is they're gonna go after Rhea, the witch, because knowing that she is the one that saw something, they think that if they can intimidate her into not saying anything, it can get them to have their plan still somehow go correctly, which at this point we don't really know what the plan is in terms of what they plan on doing, but they know that Rhea could possibly stand in the way of all of that. So then they basically head out over parts 16 and 17 to Rhea's. Roland basically comes out and is like, Rhea, you better not say shit or else you're gonna die. And then her snake, Ermac, comes out threatening to attack them, and Roland kills it, which causes Rhea to get pissed, like majorly pissed. And then what Roland says in part 18 is that essentially, while love has made him kind of blind to what has been going on, he does think, and Cuthbert actually agrees, that Susan is still important. She is a huge key to the puzzle of how they're going to go about this plan they have with essentially destroying what Jonas and like all of his gang has currently. Because obviously, for some reason, it's not good. I don't quite understand why it's not good as of yet, but it has to do with this John Varson's character that they've been searching for, or at the very least, like, they know is somehow likely tied to Martin, possibly. So, like, there's something to do with that, and I think that that's kind of the big thing. Then part 19, at the end of chapter 4, Rhea comes out and she's pissed because her snake's been killed, and she essentially curses the boys and says that they're going to get theirs. Then we move into chapter 5, which is called Wizard's Rainbow, and this goes about a few days later, where Jonas, Pape, and everybody, they're like sitting there, they're basically talking about what's going on. Then there's this man named Latigo who comes in, who tells him, like, I got shit all taken care of, like, you know, there's gonna be all this stuff. And they start basically talking about how he went to the boys saying to stay out of town on Reaping Day, like, they are not allowed to be there, which is actually against what they normally say. They usually have strangers come to Reaping Day. It's a big festival, it's like a big thing, so this is kind of out of the norm. And they think that by doing this, they can basically get the jump on the boys to then attack them and blame it on somebody else, I guess, in order to, like, get the heat off of the big coffin hunters. Then in part 2, all the boys, Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, meet up with Susan in this graveyard area in order to basically discuss what has happened. And we learned that obviously Aunt Cordelia is still attacking Susan about the fact that she thinks that she's been sleeping around with Roland, and she's been able to kind of keep the heat off of her a little bit thanks to her friend Maria, who is kind of like her handmaiden at the mayor's home. But they end up meeting up, and in part 3, Susan gets to actually meet Elaine and Cuthbert a little bit more properly, and she's like, I really hope you guys don't hate me. I'm sorry that I've kind of roped you guys into this. And, you know, they're both kind of like, honestly, we were going to be roped up into it anyway, and we're just happy that Roland's happy with you, so it's fine. Like, it's not the most ideal of situations, but if he's happy, we're happy, kind of thing. There in part 4, they start talking about essentially what has happened. They start talking about that they have basically upset somebody that's a friend of John Farson, who they believe is somebody like they're supposed to be looking out for. They talk about how Farson intends to a battle, or perhaps a series of them, in the Shavan Mountains toward the northwest of Gilead, which I think is going to have something to do with what happens later that we learn about in terms of, like, the reason why they're sent to Magus. Roland says to the forces of the affiliation moving toward him, he will seem trapped. In a more ordinary course of things, that might even have been true. Farson intends to engage them, trap them, and destroy them with the weapons of the old people. These he will drive with oil from Sitka, which is the whole oil production that's been going on. These weapons he's going to be using are powered by that oil, which I guess is kind of the reason they were looking into the oil in the first place, because they were trying to understand what it was being used for, saw the weapons, and then they kind of made a connection. And I don't know necessarily how they know that Farson is going to cause some kind of battle or war, but I'm guessing that's based on prior knowledge that we might learn a little later. Essentially, they decide that they are going to have to try to kill 200 soldiers, the 4 of them, by basically rigging up the oil field to explode and kill all these people, and then whoever they don't kill, lead them into the mountains where the Thinny is, and essentially trap them in the mountains for the Thinny to then possibly get. just because they know they can't get everybody with the oil field, and so they have to find another way to like drag the rest of them out there and still in a sense kill them. And then part 5, Susan's like, what? You guys are absolutely insane if you think that 1, that's gonna work, and 2, that you're gonna come out of this alive. But Roland does tell Susan that they're gonna need her help, because they're gonna need someone to kind of like help them set up this stuff. And she's like, all right, tell me what you need me to do. I'll do it. And they can also get Shimi involved as well. They refine the plan in part 6, and then they realize that there's still something to be resolved, which is the whole thing with Rhea, the witch. And there's this whole thing that's been happening where when Roland has talked to Susan about what exactly Rhea had said to her that caused her to try to cut all her hair off after having sex with Roland, she's like, there's a lot of it where it's just pink. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just pink. So Roland and Elaine then decide that they're going to hypnotize her again, which essentially is going to cause her to start picking into the memory of what exactly really happened. This sends Roland back into the past, like in his mind, in part 7 of this chapter, to learn about essentially what's called the Wizard's Rainbow. This is something his father talks about to them right before they leave Gilead. And the Wizard's Rainbow essentially is this set of glass orbs that are all different colors that allow you to do certain different things, whether it's look into the past, look into the present, but it's all evil, it's not good, and they all have distinctly a tie to the Dark Tower. He says that there's one in particular that's specifically for the tower, which is a black one. Now, the one that he wanted them to be aware of is what's called Maryland's grapefruit. It's a pink one, which is similar. The way it's described is what it seems like Rhea may have. There is a point that, like, I actually forgot to mention earlier when Roy is talking to Jonas, Reynolds, and Latigo about how Jonas had given Rhea the glass orb that John Farsons had. And the whole thing with this is that John Farsons is rumored to have at least one of these glass balls. Because Roland's father says John Farson is said to have a talisman, something that glows in his tent late at night, sometimes before battles, sometimes before large movements of troop and horse, sometimes before momentous decisions are announced, and it glows pink. Which, again, because we know going into this that Rhea's glass ball glows pink and she's able to see things kind of as they're happening without really any other context, not like listening or anything, just being able to see it. This is likely what she has, is this Maryland's grapefruit, this talisman that was originally John Farsons that somehow Jonas had gotten a hold of, then was able to give to Rhea at the very beginning of the book, is what we learned. There is this tie to John Farsons we see, but I'm not really sure who John Farson is, if he's some kind of like military agent that's working for Martin, that's threatening like to destroy the sanctity of Gilead. I'm not 100% certain, but Roland's father's basically like, I don't know if you're going to see this thing at all, but be aware of it, because if you come across it, it is a dangerous thing and we need to get our hands on it, because if it gets into the wrong hands again, i.e. John Farson, it could cause some pretty bad things to happen. And so what happens is then back in part 8, they're continuing with the hypnosis, and Susan talks about how she sees this ball. And that is kind of how Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert start to realize that there's a lot more to what's going on here than they just had already thought. And essentially, that's kind of where they go from there. Then they leave in part 9. They decide to go their separate ways, and they talk about how what's coming up is the Fin de Año, which is kind of like New Year's for them. It's kind of the end of the year before the reaping. It's the week before the reaping, and it's this kind of like year-end festival, which then we go into chapter 6 called Closing the Year, where it is Fin de Año. It's, celebrations are going on. People are preparing because they also have to prepare for the reaping that's coming up in the next week, which is kind of the first part of that. And it talks about how, everything's happening, but what's going to happen here at Fin de Año is going to be a huge catalyst for the rest of this story, because it says for about 2 years from that point on, the world as it has been will be swept away. It starts here. So something really bad happens here that then causes a massive wave of things to happen, which likely sets Roland off on his journey following Walter O'Dim. That is my guess. Then we go back to seeing Coral Thorin again, who sees Shimi go off to Seafront, where he's going to be picking up some graph. And then we see Shimi actually dropping off stuff and filling it up and then hiding away to where this place Susan is hiding away. And they basically toss out this graph, which is like alcohol of some kind. And instead, in these barrels, they start putting fireworks in, basically. And that is likely what's going to be used to start this big kerfuffle of shit to happen. And that is where I end off with that on page 600. One thing I want to say is that I feel like what I'm going to have to do, unless this gets a little bit more involved in learning about who John Parsons is, I do think I'm going to have to look up some references in terms of learning about who he is and what his whole ploy is within this. Now, I don't know if it's because we haven't really had a convenient point to learn about what John Farson is supposed to be, or I may have missed it entirely. It's entirely possible, but I am curious to know how exactly John Farson is tied to this town, and then therefore what does that mean in terms of like how he's tied to Gilead, because obviously Roland's father Stephen knows he's somehow involved in what's going on in Gilead, but is he tied to Martin? Is he tied to something else entirely that's even worse? I don't know. But somehow this talisman that he had got passed down to Rhea that is incredibly dangerous, and obviously they need to keep an eye out for it and bring it back to them to be safe so that nobody else can use it. But again, what is the tie with John here? Where does he come in all of this? What is his whole thing in ties with the Citgo? What even is the point of the Citgo? Is it actually supposed to be just a camp for him to start building weapons, and Jonas's team is kind of the, not proprietors, but they're the ones that are like taking care of it? Like they're the ones that are actually getting the weapons ready for John? Is that what's happening? I'm not 100% certain. So unless this gets explained more in the next couple hundred pages of this book, I think I'm gonna have to look that up in terms of like being able to tell you guys specifically what it is in this book that we're supposed to know about John Parsons, because I don't know whether or not they're gonna outright fully tell us, because it's entirely possible as well that this character is gonna come up in the next 4 books, because we still have The Wind Through the Keyhole, The Wolves of the Kala, Song of Susanna, and The Dark Tower. So it is entirely possible that whatever it is we don't know in this one could come up later, but I'm not sure. So that's why I want to make sure that I do some research on it before coming to you guys to give you 100% what I can tell you about this. Because if there's anything else that we learn in the other books, I want to save that for when it comes up in those other books, as opposed to trying to tell you guys everything right here, right now, because I'm assuming that most of you that watch these videos have already read these books, maybe more than once, and so you're kind of seeing how my thoughts are with reading it the first time. But for those of you that may have read it and are not 100% clear on everything that's going on, I would like to be able to have some knowledge of what's going on, at least in this particular book, so that like I can help whoever it is that might be reading this and be like, what the hell is this John guy all about? Because Lord knows I would appreciate having a video like that from reading it for the first time and being like, all right, I need somebody else to tell me what the heck just happened. Hey guys, so it's about 11:25 in the morning on Monday, and I've reached page 700, so let's go over everything that happened. So we start off with part 4 of chapter 6, where we've just learned that essentially Fin de Año, or Year's End, is coming. It's the week before the reaping, and the plans to get the Citgo destroyed and take out Jonas's army is underway. We see, though, that Reynolds ends up going out to the Citgo as well to check on everything, and essentially everything looks to be going well. Everything seems to be working as well as they should. Then part 5, we go back to Rhea of the Coos, who essentially you start seeing is basically withering away. It talks about how, like, as days go by, she gets worse and worse because she's become so infatuated with the wizard's glass that she has that she's basically just, the life is being sucked out of her. Part 6, we go to Jonas, and essentially he sees these kids who earlier had cut off the tail of a dog, and he yelled at them and threatened them basically so that they ran away, he sees that they are essentially like trying to be younger versions of the big coffin hunters, and he sees them toss a piece of liver that's filled with fireworks that are around because of the fair, and they feed it to a dog, and that dog is maimed. There's quite a few instances in here where there's some animal abuse, and it's not very pretty. Then we end up going to Cuthbert, Elaine, and Roland. They're actually going toward the Eyebolt, which is the canyon where they're getting stuff set up. They're putting gunpowder there to set up for the explosions that they're planning on to have the army trapped. Part 8, we go basically back to Susan, where she is also in preparation for Fair Day. They're doing a lot of stuff with the mayor and the mayor's wife. She basically ends up going then also back to her father's office, which has a lot of stuff, you know, that he's kept that hasn't really been looked at since her father's passing several years before. And she finds one of the books that he had that looks like a lot of, like, it had tracked basically all of the livestock they had and the horses, and there seems to be multiple pages missing. Then her aunt comes in, who is just yelling and cussing and screaming at her, and essentially she's like, you need to get out of here. If I don't see you again, you know, I'll count my life good, basically. So Susan leaves, and then we see Olive Thorne, who is the mayor's wife. We had seen before, was kind of still in love with her husband, even though she's known for a long time he's not interested in her, and because she's not able to bear children, he's kind of done an away with her, but she still loves him. And she actually has been having dreams, more so recently, about how things are going to be probably going for the worse. They're kind of like premonitions in a sense, but she doesn't say anything about that. Part 10 is basically more of Jonas and the gang getting stuff kind of all set up. They're talking about how there's a lot of stuff to prepare for. They've got plans essentially moving, and this is getting to be really the start of a lot of it. Part 11, Susan and Roland meet, and essentially they're starting to realize, like, once this plan kind of goes, some bad stuff's going to happen. And so Roland has her promise that essentially once things happen, and if things go really bad, she needs to go. She needs to take his guns and go to his father, who is toward Gilead. They have sex a couple more times, and it ends up actually being told here that that's like the last time that they're going to, because from here things get really bad, and we don't know necessarily at this point what really happens, but we know that this is going to be the last time, because we already know that based on how things happened in The Gunslinger and how Roland talks about Susan, is that she's either dead or is missing or something like that. He is no longer able to see her in some capacity. So we at least know going into this book nothing good is going to happen, but we see here that essentially, like, this is the last time they're actually going to lay together. Part 12, which goes back to Aunt Cordelia, who is basically taking some of Susan's clothes and putting them on essentially what they call just like Stuffy Boy, which essentially is a scarecrow. Really, that's all it is, and she burns it, and it's kind of a ritual of sorts that she does because she's pissed, because she, you know, tried to do these things to help Susan, and Susan's just completely done away with all of the plans she had. Then on part 13, which is the last part of chapter 6, there's some people in town who wake up in the middle of the night and they look at the moon, and what's coming is what they call the demon moon, which is essentially when the Reap Festival starts happening. But unfortunately, there seems to be kind of this redness on the moon, kind of the idea of having blood on the moon, and to them, the blood, especially on the demon moon, is not good. That means bad things are going to happen, which we move into chapter 7 with, called Taking the Ball, where essentially we see in the first couple of parts, not only does the chancellor of the mayor, Kimba Reimer, be killed by Reynolds, but DePape goes and kills the mayor. And from here, essentially, they're making it so that the boys are framed for this murder. These two are killing these people, but they're basically planting evidence to show that Roland and his gang had done it. And essentially from there, that's when things kind of start going crazy. And then we go into part 4, where this is all happening. They're being attacked by Fran Lengel, who's one of the deputies, and like the rest of the posse that Jonas has basically set up, and they're being arrested and taken into town because everybody is talking about how, because this evidence was planted, it's them, you know, they're the ones that killed the mayor and the chancellor. And that goes on for a couple of parts, essentially, with Roland actually stating the fact that he knows that Jonas was originally a gunslinger and he's in exile. It's not like he knew the entire time, but he does start to realize, essentially has this kind of aha moment where he's like, oh my god, Jonas used to be a gunslinger and he was exiled, and he kind of is getting a thorn put in Jonas's side even more than he already had, and they essentially are just taken into town. From there, we get to part 7, where Maria wakes up Susan, who's still at the mayor's house. Basically, Maria's like, you need to go, like, the boys have been arrested and you're likely next. If they find out that you have any affiliation with them, get out of here, go. And then we go back to Reynolds with this, who is talking with Roy and Jonas, and they're kind of just talking about, you know, what's next, what are they planning on doing, what are they planning on, you know, starting out from here. And they're kind of just scheming, not really anything super important. Then we see Rhea going and doing this kind of like, I don't know whether or not she's in control of this woman, but you start seeing like this woman from town who, after her daughter leaves, gets herself naked, and in order to clean the corners of the house, just starts licking the floorboards and the walls. But I don't know if Rhea's like controlling her. I don't think that's the case. She's kind of just spying on her, and it's basically making her like, it's some form of entertainment for her. But then she sees that Jonas and Roy and Reynolds come to the house, and they're like, hey, we need this orb, and you got to come with us, because there was this plan where once the mayor was essentially like killed or something, or, you know, they made this kind of deal with her that she basically would be brought into the mayor's home or something. I don't quite know, but either way, they tell her that they need to take the orb back. And what happens is that the orb goes from a pink color to this black color, and then for the next couple of parts, you see that like it's had a massive effect on Rhea. They see her that she's basically just like this completely disfigured woman, even more than she already was because of what this orb had done. And they get her all packaged up, and they start heading into the town, and she's kind of just, it seems like she's going crazy, and this orb is something she's not really wanting to give up because she's kind of enamored with it. It's got a certain power that makes her very hungry for it all the time. And they decide that they're going to take her to the mayor's home in Seafront. And then we move into chapter 8, called The Ashes, which from here, a lot of stuff also gets pretty freaking crazy. There's a lot of stuff in terms of like with now panic setting in this town because the mayor and his chancellor have both been killed. There's a lot of questions as to what's going to be happening because the reaping is still coming. Like, it's not gonna necessarily be canceled, but like that spells really disastrous things for a lot of people. So Susan is basically wandering through town, and she sees all these people basically going crazy, and she ends up going back to her home to get some things, and her aunt is there, and her aunt's going crazy, and she starts basically throwing these ashes at her and cursing her and basically denouncing her. It's kind of just like this thing where it's not a good thing for somebody to do that because you're seen as like evil or you are no longer pure. Susan basically is like, you know, I forgive like you for what you may have done to my father, because she thinks that Aunt Cordelia had something to do with her father's death in order to get the money that he had. And she does admit that she's with Roland, and she's like, yeah, I've been with Roland, or Will as Aunt Cordelia knows him. And she's like, yeah, and we're gonna be married by year's end, and I'm pregnant with his kid, so fuck you, basically. And then Susan ends up leaving her aunt there, and she sees Rhea with Roy, Reynolds, and Jonas going down the road, but she hides away so that nobody can see her. She knows if they see her, they're gonna get her, and it's not a good idea. Then she goes out to a place where Roland tells her that the stuff that he needs her to take if things go south is going to be, and she decides though that that's not where she's going to go. She's going to go do something before that, and that involves essentially breaking them out of jail. But before we see that there's some people basically talking about what's been happening, and they're getting the people brought together to kind of see that these are the people that killed the chancellor and the mayor, and everyone's kind of like showing up because they're like, okay, we're gonna like punish them, and you know, these are the people that caused this mayhem. And on her way into town, Susan stops at this place where she's seeing the entire herd of cattle that was hidden away from the rest of this town. For some reason, this is like a big deal where like this entire herd of cattle or livestock is like, the fact that it's not being accounted for is like a really bad thing. And I'm not 100% sure why that is, what that has to do with like the oil patch or the weapons that are going to be made for John Farson. I'm not 100% certain. Again, that's something I'm going to have to look up, but obviously that's a really big thing. And it has something to do with the fact that it's likely what led to Susan's father's death. That's all that I can see as like any kind of a tie. Somehow he knew about this, which led somehow to what the bigger scheme was, and that likely had caused his death. And so with Susan seeing it for the first time really in its entirety, she's very much pissed, and it has even more reason to go and break Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine out of jail. She meets up then with Sheemy, and she's like, are you willing to help me? Like, I really need your help if you are willing to give it. And Sheemy's like, well, yeah, like, I'm not gonna let them stay in jail. I want to help. And Sheemy's like a very sweet character, and this is something I see a lot with Stephen King, is that he always, especially in these larger kinds of stories, always has at least one character who's a little slower, who ends up kind of being like the savior of the day by accident, but also not by accident. Like, it's a really kind of weird thing where like they don't ever really want to get involved with a lot of stuff that's bad to them, but they know that it's not really bad at a certain point, and like they have to do what they think ends up being right. And because you see this in The Stand with Cullen, he's a very slow character, and his best friend is a deaf guy, and you know, like, he's just, you don't think that he's going to end up being the huge savior of the day at any point, but he ends up being the savior by the end of it. Like, he ends up being like a character who actually does really good things to some of the other characters that ends up like making the story then that much better. Sheemy's kind of like that too, and I really, really appreciate that. Like, and what's funny is I see a lot of similarities between Sheemy and Tom, in the sense that like I think that they could, you know, have been like the same person at some point, but it's just really funny to see how Sheemy and Tom both in the Dark Tower world are kind of the same kinds of characters, where they're the slow ones. Everyone doesn't think that they're much of anything, but they end up actually being like one of the strongest and one of the coolest characters that you see in the entirety of the story. So then part 10, we see essentially this mysterious person heading toward the sheriff's office where Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine are being kept, and this person goes in and wreaks havoc on the men that are basically warding the three boys, and we find out it's Susan. She basically uses the guns to kill the both of them and helps them escape, and that's pretty much the entirety of the rest of chapter 8. Then we get into chapter 9, which is reaping. So all this stuff has happened. We've got, you know, Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine out of jail. They're all heading to some place to hide. We meet up with Sheemy, who had gone off and done another errand for Susan after helping get her into the sheriff's office. Cuthbert says that we need to essentially find a place that's not going in the direction of where we're going, which is toward the oil patch, but we need a place that we're going to be able to hide, because after we get done with what's happening at the oil patch, things are going to get pretty crazy, and we're going to need a place to hide out for a little while. So then they head toward the oil patch, and they get stuff set up to where they are gonna have stuff rolling, because now that they've escaped from jail, they can get their, you know, all their stuff set up so that they can take down Jonas and their team. But they have to be careful, because now that they're going to find out soon that these guys escaped, and that's not going to be good, so they're going to be out looking for them, so they got to be quick. And what ends up happening is they stop for a second, and Roland and Susan start talking, and then we go back to Jonas, who essentially is realizing that things are going to go south, and he's not happy about it. He's got this really weird feeling that something's wrong, and then he finds out that the boys escaped, and so now he's hell-bent on finding them again because he knows that they are going to do the thing they were set out that they were going to do beforehand, and it's only a matter of time. But Susan's like, something's gonna happen and it's not gonna be good, and I'm a little scared. Like, she's got this feeling of dread inside of her, even though like she knows that what's going to happen between her and Roland is kind of expected. It's not something she wants, which is she's afraid something's going to happen to him, and she's going to be by herself, especially now that she knows that she's carrying his child. Like, that's kind of terrifying for her. So part 5, which is the last part I was able to read before reaching page 700, is Roland and Susan basically talking about the fact that it's entirely likely that things are not going to go the way that they want. He thinks that it's possible that the odds that he will survive are better than what Jonas thinks, but he still isn't 100% certain whether or not he's going to survive this. And so he again tells her that if things go south, she needs to run and go to his father, because at the very least his father will protect her and take care of her, but he can't guarantee that, you know, it's going to turn out exactly the way that they expect. And they kind of just have a moment where they decide that they're going to like just snuggle up and just hold on to each other, because even though, you know, it's likely the last time it's going to happen, they want to be able to comfort each other. We're getting to the end of this, I think, story of what happens with Susan and Roland, and I'm very sad. I don't want to read what happens to her, but I have to, and I'm curious to know what happens, but I'm also like just really, really scared. Hey guys, so it is now 8:20 on August 12th, it's Thursday. Holy crap, I have not been able to update you guys in a couple of days because I've been in a really weird mood. Well, I guess weird mood's not the thing. I've just been really, like, addicted to watching Critical Role's D&D campaigns the last couple of days. I've been watching Exandria Unlimited as the episodes come out, and then I decided I was going to undertake a massive challenge, which was to go back to The Legend of Vox Machina, and which is their very first campaign, and start from the beginning. And any of you guys follow Critical Role, you will know that those episodes can be anywhere from 2 to 5 hours a piece. And there's over 100 episodes in The Legend of Vox Machina, and then I think 140 more than in The Mighty Nein, which, holy crap, I'm going to be in for a long time. So that's kind of why I haven't been picking this up lately. I did get to page 801, so we're going to start talking about everything that happened. We are properly into, like, the final chapter, I think, that's going to entail the story of Roland and Susan, and I'm going to say now it's not faring very well, and I'm a little scared. So let's start off with where we are. So starting off on part 6 of chapter 9. So where did we end up last time? It's the point where I think Roland and Susan, they've split up because they are trying to protect Susan, and Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine are going to, like, fuck shit up, basically. So we end up with Jonas and his gang as well as Rhea, and we're just kind of sitting around with them. They're talking about kind of the plan that's going on, and Rhea's kind of getting on Jonas's nerves. And then we go back to Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine, who are preparing to leave, and basically Roland starts to tell Susan that essentially what happens is what they're going to do is they're going to blow up the tankards that are in the oil patch, and then they're going to drive most of the men that are kind of there that haven't already been killed by the explosion of those tankers to this mountain area that is essentially infested with this thing called a thinny. We're going to basically use the thinny as a way to kill off the rest of the guys that are there. So Roland tells her that hear explosions when the tankers go and smell the smoke. Even with the wind the wrong way, I think you'll smell it. No more than an hour later, more smoke. There, that'll be the brush pile in front of the canyon's mouth. Then the next part, Roland talks to Cuthbert and Elaine about how they're feeling, kind of what they think is going to be going on, you know, things like that. And that's basically preparing now for the big fight, essentially. Then we go back to Jonas in part 9, where he and his boys are kind of making their way where they're supposed to. And at one point, Jonas gets a hold of the wizard's glass that Rhea has, which is also what Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine are trying to go. They're basically going to start off where they're going to attack Jonas's camp because they see them heading on their way to the oil patch, essentially. So they're going to attack them because they understand that Rhea has the ball. And so they're going to try to get that if they can and then go from there. And so Jonas starts to kind of get attached to this wizard's glass. He gets a glimpse at the pink orb that it is, and essentially Rhea's kind of taunting him about it because she's like, I've been with this thing for God knows how long, and you're the one that gave it to me, but you don't know the extent of its powers like I do, that kind of thing. So then essentially Jonas starts to kind of plot, essentially, and they've decided that they're gonna like do a bit of a side trip. When he looks in the orb, he understands that Roland's team has this plan. He's able to see the plan that they have involved where they're gonna ambush Jonas, take the ball, all these things. So he decides he's gonna try to do something that they weren't expecting, which is to basically turn around and almost head back toward town. And the boys catch this and they're just like, well, if we're going to do this, we got to do this now. Cuthbert's like, well, what about Suzanne and Sheemy? Because they're kind of shacked up together somewhere to protect themselves. And Roland's like, we're not going to know whether or not they're safe, but we just need to like do this now. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it now. Then we go back to Susan, who she's sitting and basically like waiting for Roland to come back, but Jonas ends up actually he basically splits himself off from his group to go after Susan, and the rest of them are going back toward town. And so they capture Susan, and Sheemy gets out of it because he went off to go pee and kind of missed this whole kerfuffle happening. And so for the next couple of parts, that's kind of what we're looking at. Then we see part 13, we go back to Cuthbert, and they're kind of just waiting to attack. Then part 14, we see Jonas, like they meet up with their team again, and they decide that they're going to have Reynolds take Susan back to town, take her to Coral Thorin, and they're going to have them deal with it. And then essentially because of like everyone knowing that she's the reason that the boys escaped from prison, they're likely to do things to her that are going to be punishment worthy. Not only do they get Reynolds to take Susan away, they actually get Rhea frightened. They actually threaten her life and are able to take the wizard glass from her, and she takes off running, and she's like just booking it because she knows that if she doesn't, her life's going to be in danger. And Sheemy ends up actually, you see him, he starts to make his way following Reynolds back to town as best he can. The mule that he had was missing because they took the mule, left it somewhere, and so they don't know where it is at this moment, but Sheemy's kind of just walking back toward town, which is a long way, like it's a very, very long way, like probably almost a day's worth of riding. Then Elaine, Cuthbert, and Roland, they see kind of everything happening, and they decide that they're going to start getting ready to really attack these guys, and they're kind of hoping things are going to go bad. They don't know anything about the fact that Susan's been captured as of yet. They don't know anything about regarding that. They just see Jonas and DePape come back, and they're going to like attack like soon, especially because they see that Jonas now has the wizard glass. They want to get that in, you know, because it's very important to them. They have to take that back to Roland's father and do something with it because they know that it has something to do with this entire plot line involving Roland's father and likely what's going on in Gilead. So then we see Reynolds taking Susan back, and it's not a great time. And then we cut back to Cordelia, who is Susan's aunt, and she comes home and sees this woman that is like dirty, ugly. She's like on the brink of death. We realize it's Rhea. Rhea has stumbled into her home and is like, I need your help. You know that your niece is like the devil, and I can help you with that. I can help you with getting her punished properly. I need you to help me though. And essentially the way that she's able to help is that Cordelia has to essentially give her blood to Rhea, who then ingests it, and it's essentially like a vitality thing. It's like, I don't know, it's drinking the blood of the young to stay young, something like that, I think, kind of the idea. Even though Cordelia is not really that young, she is kind of older, but not to the point where I think Rhea even cares. She's just like, hey, I can use you. We have the same goal. I need your blood, give me it, like, right now. Go back to Roland, and from there, we start this big fight scene where Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert fuck up Jonas's band that he currently has, like, fuck them up to the point where, like, there is no person left alive besides Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert. It's freaking awesome. Like, this has got to be one of my favorite sets of stories that shows, like, action scenes. I don't know what it is with Stephen King, but anything to do with, like, his fantasy work, the action scenes are really nice. Like, they flow really well. They don't feel like it's too much. It's a little gory, I'm gonna say. But then they do end up getting the wizard's glass, and Roland accidentally, like, takes it out of the bag it's in, and he gets sucked into it, and that's the end of chapter 9. Then we go into chapter 10, which is Beneath the Demon Moon 2. We start off where Susan is brought back to town, and she's being put under the watch of Coral and the rest of the town because they are planning on essentially punishing her under the Demon Moon, which is that night. It is now Reap Night, and everyone's pissed because, you know, there's so much going on. You've got the mayor who was killed, the chancellor who was killed, and everyone's basically down in the dumps, which is not normal for this year-end festival. And so, because they know that Susan has to do with what's happened, Rhea and Cordelia go to a bar, and they end up essentially convincing everybody that in order to make things right, they have to kill Susan, essentially. They have to punish her. They have to, like, kill her in front of the entire town, essentially, like a public hanging or whatever it is that they decide to do, which likely is actually going to be pretty much like burning her at the stake. So then part 3 of that chapter, we see Sheemy find Capricoso, his mule, and they end up riding into town the rest of the way. Sheemy goes into town, and he's seeing all these people that are going crazy, and he comes across Olive Thorne, who is the widow of the mayor, and she's like, I know you're after the girl, I'm gonna help you, but you need to help me real quick. I don't have everything that I need, and I need somebody to, like, help me get through this whole thing. Part 5, we go back to Roland, who is currently in the wizard glass. This is where he really gets to understand, like, his purpose is, like, the tower. And he starts seeing all these things. He's actually at one point sees Susanna, the entire land of roses that are before the Dark Tower. He sees the Dark Tower itself. He sees all these things, and it essentially is the equivalent of Roland coming to find his purpose in his life, where he understands that the tower is what he's supposed to go to. It's something that he becomes very obsessed with. Now, here is my thing with this, because I have, in this entire part of this book, what I have seen is that it could very well have all been a lie, because from what we see of the wizard glass beforehand, it doesn't necessarily tell lies. It shows you what's going on, at least in terms of how Rhea uses it. But the way that it interacts with Roland is much more sinister. And I have a distinct feeling that in the reality of the situation is going to be that either the Dark Tower doesn't really exist and this glass had taken something and put a seed in Roland's mind that then just immediately blossomed and he became obsessed with. He wakes up out of the slumber that he's put under in the wizard glass by Cuthbert and Elaine. He wakes up and he's like, guys, we gotta go, we gotta finish what we were doing, but I will tell you what I saw as we ride, kind of thing. Then we jump back to Olive, who is working with Maria, who was the handmaiden that Susan had in during her time in the mayor's home, and they essentially are working on getting Susan out, and they're trying to do this as easily and quickly as possible before anybody notices. Then we go back to part 10, where Roland talks about how he knows that Susan's been taken prisoner, and they don't think that it's necessarily as important for them to go now. They need to go finish what they started first, because at the moment Susan seems to be perfectly fine. Nobody's hurt her too much. I mean, she's been banged up a little bit by Reynolds, but, you know, she's not in any immediate danger where they need to go and find her. And then Roland talks about how, because of what he saw in the glass, he believes that his time with Susan is limited. And essentially that once they get her and they save her, they need to go their separate ways. They're not meant to be together like he had thought they were. Because what he says is that based on what he saw in the glass, he understands that his real purpose is to go with Cuthbert and Elaine to the Dark Tower. And unfortunately, Cuthbert and Elaine are like, what the fuck are you talking about? There is no such thing as the Dark Tower. Well, Roland is insistent on this tower being real because he says that he believes that their fathers know about it. Beyond the Dark Land, I can't remember its name now, it's one of the things I've lost, is Endworld, and in Endworld stands the Dark Tower. Its existence is the greatest secret our fathers keep. It's what has held them together as Katet across all the years of the world's decline. So he has a strong belief that this is true. Now, we don't know necessarily whether that is true, but this is why I started to think that maybe there's a little bit of a delusion going on of sorts where the glass has kind of lied to Roland and none of this could possibly be real, because I just don't really see how else Roland would get super obsessive with this. I think that the glass must have implanted something in his brain to get him to be obsessive about this and then forget everybody else that he cared about. And this is why in his time with Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Oy, he becomes very distant with them, and he immediately is like, these people are not going to be with me forever. They're going to end up, possibly being cannon fodder, essentially, when it comes to going to the Dark Tower. They're going to end up like everybody else has in my life, where they're either going to die or I'm not going to be able to have them in my life anymore because I need to get to the Dark Tower, and the Dark Tower just takes everything from me. That's kind of the idea I've been getting. Now, whether or not that's true, we have yet to see. Then we go back to Susan, who she and Olive are trying to get out of town. Olive is trying to get her away from everything, and Sheemy ends up going his separate way as well. He ends up being told to go stay in town and try to drive everybody away from her and Olive so that they can escape. And then we go to Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine again, and they are getting everything set up to where they're going to go hit the tankards, and they start to descend on the tankard area, and then we jump back to Olive and Susan, who unfortunately get caught up with Reynolds and Rhea and a couple other people that are involved in this whole scheme that was involved with Jonas. So essentially, Olive unfortunately gets killed, and it's not looking good for Susan. That's all I'm gonna say. Part 14, we basically watch the boys fuck shit up again and destroy the tankard area, and for many parts of this next section is basically that. They're destroying the tankards and they're luring the men that haven't been killed by the exploding tankards to the mountains, and we do see at one point that Cuthbert and Elaine nearly get killed by the Thinny, because the Thinny is not partial to any particular person. It will kill whatever it wants to kill, and so Roland has to try to help them. And then unfortunately what they realize is that after all of this happens, Roland gets the distinct message and feeling that Susan's in danger, more so than they thought she was ever going to be in, and they realize that essentially they need to book it and hope to whatever gods are out there that they are not too late, because it is not looking good for what's happening. Everything seems to be just awful. And basically from there, that's where we end for right now. So I'm currently on page 801. It's not looking very good for poor Susan. It is now going on 11 o'clock at night, and it's done. Wizard and Glass is done. And truthfully, okay, so I'm a little shocked with how the last 90-some pages of this ended up, because I think it just went in areas I wasn't expecting, and there is some very interesting information in terms of other books that are tied to the Dark Tower series that I was not aware of, that gets brought up in the, afterward. But let's get into the last 90 pages of this book, shall we? Because, oh boy, was it a ride. So first and foremost, unfortunately in part 23 of chapter 10, we do see Susan killed in the exact way that I thought she was going to be killed, where she's placed upon a fire and burned to death in front of the entirety of the town. That happens over the course of a couple different parts, and in between that, we see Roland, Elaine, and Cuthbert trying to make their way to town, and obviously it doesn't work, but because at one point Roland gets sucked into the orb again, and he's actually able to see the entirety of what happens to Susan. Like, he gets a bird's eye view of what happens to her as she burns to death, crying out that she loves Roland. And it was honestly incredibly heartbreaking for me. I didn't end up crying because I held it in a little bit, but it was really, really hard to read that scene because I kind of knew it was going to happen, but I didn't expect it to, like, happen exactly the way it did, and I was kind of hoping there might have been a last-ditch effort to save her, and it didn't happen. So, basically from there, what happens is Roland kind of goes catatonic. I mean, obviously, he literally just watched the woman he loves be killed, and he couldn't save her. And he talks about how, later on in the book, how while he may not have killed her, the actions in which he had in terms of going to the Dark Tower ended up killing her, and ended up actually killing a lot of people he cares about over the course of time. So they end up waking up a couple days later after the events of the Demon Moon and of Reap Night, and they are heading back toward Gilead, toward his father. Then we get into part 4, which is called All God's Chillun's Got Shoes. And we start off with the first chapter, the first part being where essentially Roland in the present time has finished the story of what's happened, and everyone's kind of, for the first couple of parts, really trying to, like, sink in the information of what's happened. And honestly, all of them feel really bad for Roland because he did so much. He tried so hard to do the right thing, and he really, he was in love at such a young age, and he went through so many things at the age of 14 that the three of them, Eddie, Susanna, and Jake, would have seen cripple other 14-year-olds from their time. Like, most 14-year-old kids that would have gone through that probably would have died at some point, if not by the end of it killing themselves because of the pain that they went through. And so it's hard for them to wrap their heads around this whole thing. And what they end up doing, though, is that they start just kind of asking a little bit of questions here and there about what exactly happened. And at one point, they talk about how there's technically more to the story, where essentially, like, the boys had gone to Gilead to meet with their father, and Roland had looked in the glass a few different times over the course of that period. And there's another story that involves the wizard's glass that is really harmful that Roland's not quite able to talk about yet because it involves the death of somebody else that's very close to him. Roland, Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Oi end up continuing down on this road. They're heading toward this very shiny looking building that they're not sure what it is about. And then they come across 6 pairs of shoes on Interstate 70, which is the road that they're taking. And we start with chapter 2, Shoes in the Road. And the thing is there's 6 pairs. There's 2 that are actually part of a set. They're basically dog booties for Oi, and then the rest are for the other 4 of them. And they're all red, but they're all different styles of shoes. And so what happens is they start kind of figuring out what could be the entire premise of this. And the thing is that the team starts to realize that there is a lot of things that are similar to what they're experiencing, what Roland has gone through, and the story of the Wizard of Oz. Weird enough. And they actually go through the whole thing where they tell Roland the story of the Wizard of Oz and how there's been adaptations of it. There's been, multiple stories in the world of Oz, and but basically giving him the real story of the Wizard of Oz, the original story that most people know about. And essentially they think that with these shoes, all of these shoes, they're going to be important. They're going to be some kind of a clue as to how to solve something later on down the road. And so when they get to the place that is called the Green Palace, which is similar to the palace in the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz, find this door in this building, which is, they call it a wizard's gate, and it's got a bunch of different orbs that are different colors that are similar looking to the wizard's glass that Roland had found when he was younger, the pink one. And they actually end up figuring out that they have to click their heels like Dorothy does to go home to open the gate. And they think that it's possible there's going to be somebody in there that's going to be the wizard, whether that is somebody that Roland knows that might be involved in all of this or whatever. They think there might be something a little bit more creepy. And so then what happens is they click their heels, this door opens, and it opens into this new area. And it's kind of like Oz. Like, it's not really Oz, but like it's got a lot of stuff that's kind of like making it think like it's another world, that kind of thing. And they go through the door and end up going into this place where it's like another building, basically, and they start talking to this man who says that he's the great and powerful Oz, but they think at first that it's Blaine the Mono, because there's things that are like being shown in this room that are similar to what they saw in Blaine the Mono, the train that they had destroyed at the beginning of the book, that they were all terrified of. And Oy, being like the Toto he is, similar to what happens in The Wizard of Oz, finds the little alcove where the mastermind, in a sense, is hidden, tears back the curtain, and it's the TikTok man. The TikTok man is sitting there, who, if you had watched my video looking at the Wastelands, we learned that the TikTok man was kind of like this scary guy that was involved in the story that had essentially had Jake kidnapped when the team had got to the city of Lud, and he was supposedly dead. But then what we saw at the end of the Wastelands was that Randall Flagg, also known as the Man in Black, also known as Martin, also known as various other things, he ends up getting the TikTok man to live and brings him along on his journey to stop the team from going to the Dark Tower. And then what happens is, you know, they find out that there's another guy sitting actually at the throne that is like an actual thing, because what they see is like there's a person sitting on this throne. Find the TikTok man over here who seems to be making the voice for this person, but that person actually is Randall Flagg. They try to kill him because there is a way that he can be killed, which is with the gun that was from Eddie, Susanna, and Jake's world, as opposed to Roland's guns. Roland's guns are completely ineffective toward this guy, and the Man in Black disappears, and then we end up essentially in chapter 4, The Glass, going into this story that happens about 3 days after Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine arrive back in Gilead. And there's these weird things happening. Essentially, he goes into his mother's room at one point to visit her and talk with her about how things have been going, because he's known, for one, that she was sleeping with Martin for the longest time, and, you know, he wants, I think, maybe to confront her about that, possibly. And essentially, she wants to give him this belt that she made for him, possibly as a peace offering of some kind. We're not really sure. And then all of a sudden, Rhea comes in. Rhea comes in and causes Roland to accidentally kill his own mother. And that is something that he holds so much in terms of guilt. And so in chapter 5, they wake up from this entire experience of watching this story happen, and they're trying to calm him down about it, because they're trying to like reassure him essentially that, you know, he wasn't really the one that killed his mother. Like, yes, the bullet may have gone and killed her, but the thing is that Rhea's the one that set this up. And so it's not Roland's fault that this happened. This has all been happening. And they all realize too that when they've woken up from this, not really dream, but this trip of going back in time to watch the story of Roland killing his mom, they wake up and they realize they're actually back in Midworld. And they also can literally see the path of the beam leading to the Dark Tower. They have a clear line of sight to travel down to the Dark Tower once again. And they also have their shoes, but they've lost a lot of their luster, which they decide to get rid of. And they have, like, apparently some food. Somebody left them food randomly, and they weren't really sure what happened. But then they get a warning from Randall Flagg that says, "Next time I won't leave. Renounce the tower. This is your last warning, and have a great day." The whole thing with the renouncing the tower thing is that everyone, including Roland, has been told multiple times. And one of the things you see in kind of the flashback of Roland's mother dying is Rhea tells Roland to renounce the tower, to stop looking for it, to leave it alone, because otherwise everyone's going to die that he loves. And he says no. And Eddie, Susanna, and Jake, who are watching this happen, actually are able to kind of talk with Rhea a little bit, and they're like, we're not going either. Like, we're going with him as far as he needs to go. And she's like, you're all a bunch of idiots, basically. So Randall Flagg is also has been telling Roland to stop looking from the tower all the way since the gunslinger. So this is something that, Roland's been obsessive about. It's been something that he's literally lost people over, and he's still going for it. And it's kind of one of those things where you've got the bad guys telling you, why don't you just give up? Because obviously things are not going your way. We're winning, whatever it is. And Roland and the gang are basically like, fuck you, we're still gonna go for this because we're still alive and kicking. Like, just because you may have knocked us down a few pegs doesn't mean shit. Like, we're gonna still go for this freaking tower no matter what happens. So essentially they do talk about a little what's going to be happening, and there is this like thundercloud looking symbol that's drawn on there, which tells Roland that they have to head to a place that's called Thunderclap, which is a town that he had heard of in bits and pieces over the course of the time that he was in Magus, which is where Susan was from, and then also like in his time with Susanna, Eddie, and Jake. Basically from there they end up just starting on the path to follow the beam to the Dark Tower. And that's kind of where we leave this story. And then we get into the afterword, which this was what I thought was really interesting. There's a very small note that King writes in here that I think most people would really miss, unless you're absolutely looking for it like I am, where I'm looking for any possible connections to other books that King has written that have anything to do with the Dark Tower. And he actually mentions that not only does Randall Flagg, which is from The Stand, get involved in this, but then there's another character named Ralph Roberts, who I'm not really 100% sure where he ties in, but I'll leave the information here for those of you that might be fans or you would like to know yourself. The Wandering Boys from the Eyes of the Dragon, so the story The Eyes of the Dragon's involved in the Dark Tower. And then there's a character, Father Callahan from Salem's Lot, which, if you guys have been following me for any amount of time, Salem's Lot was the second book I had read chronological wise when it came to starting my Stephen King reading series. And apparently this character, Father Callahan, which was like a pretty, I think he's like essentially the character that is like, he's a priest. He somehow gets involved in the Dark Tower because apparently, according to what this says, he rode out of New England on a Greyhound bus and wound up dwelling on the border of a terrible midworld land called Thunderclap. So maybe we'll see him when we get to Thunderclap. I'm not 100% certain, but I thought that was so cool because like this is something that, people are constantly trying to find ways that King's books relate to the Dark Tower because it's such an expansive world. Okay, so I've gone through as much as I really feel like I can with this. So what are my final thoughts on this? So like I said, definitely a 5 out of 5 stars. Loved it. This has got to be my favorite book of the series so far because I just loved how the majority of it was Roland telling the story of how exactly he became obsessed with the Dark Tower, and specifically how he met this woman Susan Delgado, who we have heard in passing so many times since The Gunslinger. And to see this actual story of a young boy falling in love and unfortunately having to lose them and lose a lot of things over the course of his endeavor to find the Dark Tower and, all these different things, and even seeing the first glimpse of when he understands what the Dark Tower is, it's incredibly heartbreaking and, just adventurous and fun, and like it was just such a treat. Like, I don't think I ever found any point in this entire book that I felt was lagging. I felt like, honestly, yes, there were some points that probably could have been cut because I always find places that just are useless information, not really needed dialogue or whatever, that could be cut, just like with any other book. But that didn't change the fact that I still, from beginning to end, was captured by this. And I will say, like, the last part of this that deals more so with Eddie, Susanna, and Roland and Jake at first I was very thrown off, just because I'm so used to having been, like, most of this book being in Roland as a 14-year-old's perspective. But I really liked the way that this story kind of then set up how the rest of the story goes. Like, the way that essentially the story goes from talking about a really traumatic event for Roland that did set him up on this journey to then explain how exactly everything ties together with Eddie, Susanna, and Jake, like basically giving them the story of why Roland's on this journey in the first place, and then kind of how he's felt about this team getting built up and how he's afraid to really let people in because he's afraid of losing them, kind of a thing. And then seeing from there how when we meet Randall Flagg and when we see Rhea in the dream that happens, like, essentially that tells the story of the events after what Roland had already talked about. The thread line that goes through those stories and those things that happen makes so much sense. It actually really sets up, I think, a lot of interesting stuff about what's going to happen with Wolves of the Kala. But I'm really excited because I'll be reading the prequel story that comes in between this book and Wolves of the Kala, which is The Wind Through the Keyhole, and I'm curious to see what that's about. There's so much in terms of questionings of what happens to Cuthbert and Elaine, because we know that they're gone as well. So what happens to them? How does Roland lose them? How does Roland, like, fare in terms of that? Like, how does, what, there's just a lot of really good questions I'm very excited to learn about, and I really hope that at the very least we get to learn a little bit more about exactly what happens to Cuthbert and Elaine, because The Wind Through the Keyhole, like I said, is supposed to be entirely a prequel story. So I would be interested to know if we get those answers in that, or if it's something we have to learn a little bit later in, like, Wolves of the Kala or Song of Susanna or in The Dark Tower, the final book. So yeah, really, really loved this. I would love to know what your guys' thoughts are on this. I feel like for most people, this has been the favorite. I feel like that's been the case because truthfully, I feel like this is the reason why people love this series. One of the many. I mean, honestly, the other 3 books were still really good, like 4 stars, all 3, and then this is the first 5 star. I'm curious to know, though, for especially those longtime Stephen King fans and massive Dark Tower fans, where do you stand as far as your favorite and why? Like, without spoilers, because I'm not through the whole series yet. Tell me what you guys' thoughts were, because I just want to know what's the favorite, and, you know, is it this one? Because it's my favorite, and I really hope you guys like it too. Thank you all so much for joining me in this video. If you guys really enjoyed this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an Owlette in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.